In the spring of 1927, relentless storms drowned the Mississippi River basin, saturating land across 11 states until the levees, trusted for decades, collapsed in 145 places. Within days, 27,000 square miles vanished beneath floodwaters deeper than 30 feet, turning towns into islands and farms into lakes. More than 600,000 people were forced from their homes, while leaders realized too late that America's flood defenses were a dangerous illusion. But how did nature and policy collide to unleash the worst flood in American history, and why did it change the nation forever? Rain began to fall across the Midwest in the late summer of 1926, and it simply refused to stop. The rain was relentless. By October, rivers in Kansas and Nebraska were already spilling their banks, but the real deluge came in the months that followed. Rainfall totals reached historic highs across 11 states, with some areas recording double their annual averages before the new year even began. In December, Nashville and Chattanooga saw their streets transformed into rivers, while upstream, tributaries like the Ohio and Arkansas swelled far beyond their usual boundaries. The Mississippi River basin acted as a giant catchment, collecting every drop from thousands of miles of land. As winter turned to spring, the ground could absorb no more. Each new storm sent runoff rushing over already saturated fields. Weather Bureau logs from Memphis and Vicksburg recorded river stages climbing higher each week, surpassing every previous measurement. By early April, the water in Cairo, Illinois, pushed so hard against the levees that the river actually reversed course in some tributaries, forcing water upstream and leaving engineers scrambling for solutions. Rain gauges in Iowa, Missouri, and Arkansas overflowed with totals that defied belief. 15 inches in a single 3-day storm in northwestern Iowa, nearly as much as some towns received in an entire year. Hydrologists at the time noted that the entire lower basin, from Illinois to Louisiana, was now primed for disaster. Soil moisture readings showed saturated conditions at every depth, meaning any additional rainfall would become immediate runoff, racing toward the main channel. With each passing week, the Mississippi's rise became less a question of if and more a matter of when it would reach the breaking point. In river towns, daily life revolved around the latest gauge readings. Newspapers printed charts alongside weather forecasts, tracking the relentless climb in feet and tenths. By mid-April, the river stood higher than at any point since records began. The levees, long considered unbreakable, were now holding back a volume of water that no engineer had ever planned for. The stage was set for a crisis that would test every assumption about flood control in America. Floodwaters swept across the heart of America, transforming the Mississippi Valley into a vast inland sea. The numbers alone defy imagination. 27,000 square miles underwater, stretching from southern Illinois to the Gulf of Mexico, a region as large as New England swallowed whole. In the Delta lowlands, the river expanded to more than 75 miles wide, erasing the familiar lines between towns, farms, and forests. From the air, entire counties vanished beneath a murky expanse, with only rooftops, treetops, and the occasional stretch of levee rising above the water. Depths reached staggering extremes. In places like the Arkansas and Mississippi deltas, the flood stood over 30 feet deep, enough to submerge 2-story houses and drown the tallest cottonwood trees. Riverboats and rescue skiffs floated above what had been fields and neighborhoods, their pilots navigating by memory alone. In the hardest-hit parishes of Louisiana, water crept up church steeples and courthouse domes, leaving only the highest ground as crowded islands of refuge for people and livestock alike. Archival maps from the period show a single, unbroken sheet of blue covering the lower basin. Rail lines and highways disappeared, cutting off entire communities for weeks. In some stretches, the only way to cross from one town to the next was by boat or makeshift raft. Photographs captured the eerie silence of drowned landscapes, miles of telephone poles marching into open water, barns and silos adrift, and families huddled on levees with their belongings piled high. The sheer volume of water forced a new perspective on the river itself. What had once been a winding channel became a force that reshaped the land, overwhelming every human effort to contain it. The scale of the disaster raised a troubling question. Could any system built by people ever hope to control a river of this magnitude? As the flood spread, it exposed the limits of engineering and the vulnerability of the communities that depended on it. For decades, the Mississippi River was held in check by a single, stubborn idea. Levees alone could tame its floods. This belief, forged in the halls of Congress and championed by the Army Corps of Engineers, shaped every mile of embankment from Cairo to the Gulf. By 1927, nearly 2,000 miles of levees lined the river's banks, built higher and thicker year after year. Congressional records from the early 1900s show a steady stream of funding for levee construction, while proposals for spillways or reservoirs were dismissed as unnecessary or too costly. The doctrine had powerful backers, planters, local levee boards, and political leaders who saw any land given up to spillways as lost profit. Inside the Corps, not all engineers agreed. Internal correspondence from as early as 1915 reveals urgent warnings about the limits of levees-only thinking. Men like General Harry H. Barrett argued for a system that would let the river safely overflow in controlled areas, diffusing its power before disaster struck. But these voices were drowned out by the majority, who insisted that higher levees, properly maintained, could withstand anything nature delivered. The result was a rigid policy, enforced by law and reinforced by pride. By the spring of 1927, the doctrine's flaws were no longer theoretical. The river, swollen by months of rain, pressed against the levees with unprecedented force. In town after town, engineers watched nervously as water seeped through earthen walls, sandbags piled ever higher in a losing race. Over the course of the flood, more than 145 levees failed, each breach a stark rebuttal to decades of official assurances. Congressional hearings later revealed the depth of the denial, warnings ignored, dissent silenced, and alternatives left unbuilt. The levees-only policy, once a symbol of American ingenuity, now stood exposed as a fatal miscalculation, one that turned a natural disaster into a human tragedy. The flood didn't just erase towns, it wiped out the economy of an entire region. In the Mississippi Delta, fields that once promised a season's profit vanished under a brown, swirling tide. The numbers that survive in crop reports and insurance ledgers only hint at the true scale. Over 16 million acres of farmland were drowned, with the heart of the nation's cotton belt taking the hardest blow. By the time the water receded, more than $400 million in property and crop losses had piled up, an amount that would top $7 billion today. For planters, the disaster was swift and merciless. Ledgers from plantations near Mound's Landing show entire inventories, cotton, corn, livestock, crossed out in a single week. Some owners lost every acre and were forced to auction land that had been in their families for generations. Insurance claims flooded local offices, but the sheer volume of destruction left many with little hope of rebuilding. Bankruptcies spread through the Delta, and court records from the months after the flood are filled with foreclosure filings and eviction notices. The blow landed hardest on those with the least to lose. Sharecroppers, mostly black families who had worked the land for generations, saw not just their crops, but their homes and tools swept away. With no savings and no collateral left, they faced a choice between hunger and leaving the only life they had known. For many, the flood meant the end of any hope for economic security in the rural South. The collapse of cotton production sent shockwaves far beyond the river's edge. Global cotton prices spiked as American exports plummeted. Textile mills in the North scrambled to find new suppliers, while Southern merchants watched their customer base vanish overnight. The financial pressure that followed would drive thousands from the land, setting the stage for an even deeper social crisis as the region struggled to recover not just from water, but from the loss of its economic lifeblood. Official records from the spring of 1927 list between 250 and 500 lives lost to the flood, but even these numbers fail to capture the true toll. Historians and survivors have long argued that the real count was far higher, especially among black sharecroppers whose deaths often went unrecorded. The Red Cross tallied what it could, but chaos and segregation left many families uncounted. What's certain is that the flood forced more than 600,000 people from their homes, a mass displacement on a scale the country had never seen. On the highest points of the levees, families gathered with what little they could carry: bedding, kitchen chairs, and battered trunks piled up in makeshift camps. Children slept wrapped in quilts beneath the open sky, while parents kept watch for passing boats that might bring news or rescue. Eyewitnesses described a world turned upside down, livestock stranded on rooftops, neighbors sharing scraps of food, and the constant low roar of water all around. For many, the river's rise meant not just the loss of a house, but the erasure of an entire community. Churches, schools, and burial grounds vanished beneath the flood, leaving memories where landmarks once stood. In the weeks that followed, survivors clung to the narrow strips of land still above water, waiting for relief or for the river to finally recede. The numbers, hundreds dead and hundreds of thousands homeless, became stories of families torn apart, lives uprooted, and a region forever changed. On the battered levees outside Greenville, Mississippi, tents and makeshift shelters stretched for miles, crowded with families driven from their homes by the rising water. These camps, meant as places of refuge, quickly became sites of control and exploitation. More than 200,000 African Americans, sharecroppers, field hands, and their children were confined under the watch of armed National Guard troops. Guards patrolled the levee tops, enforcing strict segregation and denying black refugees the right to leave. White residents moved freely, while black families were pinned in place, their movements controlled by passes that were rarely granted. Inside the camps, daily life was ruled by hunger and fear. Food rations depended on compliance. Men were ordered to repair levees, haul supplies, and clean latrines, often under threat of violence or loss of meals. The final report of the Colored Advisory Commission described how black workers received the harshest assignments with little regard for age or health. Some refused and were beaten or denied food. Others, desperate to escape, risked swimming the floodwaters at night or bribing guards for a chance to slip away. Newspapers like the Chicago Defender published stories of forced labor and abuse, fueling outrage and planting the seeds of resistance. The promise that refugees would be returned to the plantations after the flood kept many trapped in a system that closely resembled bondage. For some, the only hope lay on the northbound trains, an escape from the camps and from a region that had shown them only hardship. The injustice of the levee camps became a turning point, convincing thousands that the time had come to leave the Delta behind. Herbert Hoover stepped into the chaos of the 1927 flood with a clear sense of purpose and an instinct for public attention. Appointed by President Coolidge as the head of the Federal Relief Committee, Hoover quickly became the face of the rescue effort. His arrival in the Delta was carefully documented. Photographers snapped images of him striding through muddy camps, conferring with Red Cross workers, and surveying the endless lines of refugees. Newspapers across the country ran these photos alongside headlines praising his leadership. Behind the scenes, Hoover managed a vast network: 154 relief camps, 33,000 staff and volunteers, and hundreds of thousands in need. He wrote daily to officials in Washington, shaping the narrative of efficiency and compassion. Letters in the National Archives show how he coordinated with the press, ensuring that stories of order and progress reached the front page, while reports of abuse or racial discrimination were quietly set aside. For Hoover, every successful rescue, every shipment of supplies, became proof of his ability to manage disaster on a national scale. The flood gave Hoover a platform unlike any before. As the waters lingered, his reputation grew, first as a humanitarian, then as a leader ready for the highest office. The political capital he gained in the Mississippi Valley would soon carry him all the way to the White House. Congress responded to the devastation of 1927 with sweeping legislation unlike anything the country had seen before. The Flood Control Act of 1928 put the federal government squarely in charge of taming the Mississippi and its tributaries, ending decades of local control and piecemeal solutions. For the first time, Washington assumed full responsibility for flood protection along the river, pledging $325 million, an amount that dwarfed all previous investments in flood control. The act authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to build not just stronger levees, but an integrated system of spillways, floodways, and reservoirs. The plan called for more than 1,600 miles of reinforced levees, massive diversion channels like the Bonnet Carr and Morganza spillways, and new floodways to steer excess water safely away from cities and farms. Local levee boards were required to provide land and rights of way, but the federal government covered the cost of construction and future improvements. This new mandate transformed the Corps into the nation's lead flood fighting force, setting the stage for the largest civil works project in American history. The old belief in levees alone was swept aside, replaced by a system built to accommodate the river's power rather than deny it. Floods remain the nation's most costly natural disaster, with flood damages in the United States exceeding $20 billion annually. As climate change drives more extreme weather, the lessons of 1927 are not history, they are a warning. Federal levees and relief exist because of what happened here, but in every vulnerable community, the water still rises. What we choose to do next will decide who gets left behind. Share your thoughts below.